reading the Bible's stories imaginatively. I'm sure all of us have stories in the Bible that are our favorite stories, maybe our favorite passage in the Bible. But I would say that quite frequently we don't read the stories in the Bible imaginatively enough, which is a pity because the writers of these Bible stories use quite a lot of imagination in their writing of those stories. And so that's what I'd like us to take a look at and hopefully have time for discussion at the end. Now, I'm going to begin not with a Bible story. I'm going to begin with a story from outside of the Bible. I'm going to begin with a passage from a novel, a fairly recently published British novel. Now, for those of you for whom the Sabbath hours are not usually spent in reading fiction, let me explain that I'm going to read this, but this is going to serve a higher purpose. All right. So let me read. These are the opening 3 paragraphs of a modern 21st century English language story. And I just want to take a look at what is typical about this introduction to this story, this narrative. She was a slight woman, pale with 2 wings of dark hair which framed her face and gave it the faintly bird-like quality that characterized her person. Even at this distance of time, which has clarified much that was obscure to me, I find her essence hard to capture. She was youthful in appearance, but there was also an air of something ambiguous about her, which was both intriguing and daunting. When we met, she must have been in her 40s, but in a certain light she could have been 14 or 400. Though when I say light, I perhaps mean that subtle light of the mind, which casts as many shadows as it illuminates, but in the right conditions can reveal a person's being more accurately than the most powerful beam. Once I would have known her age to the day, since it would have been part of the bald list of information on her medical file: name, sex, date of birth. Of the last detail, I have a hazy recollection that her birthday was in September. So those are the opening lines of this novel, The Other Side of You by Sally Vickers. And I read it simply because it's a typical 21st century Western story. Let's look at its characteristics. You notice that the story is quite clear about the physical, excuse me, when I get this, about the physical, I can't, excuse me. I don't know whether, is your screen flashing?
No, it's not flashing on our side.
Okay, I think I've got it. Okay, I was trying to get this. So notice that we have a fair bit of detail about the physical appearance of this woman. We know that she has a slight build. She's pale in complexion. She has dark hair, which frames her face. We're told that she looks a little bit like a bird because of those characteristics, and also that she's youthful in appearance. So we're beginning to build up what this woman looks like. We get physical description. But not only do we get physical description, what she looks like physically, but we're also told something about something within her psychology, the kind of person she is. The author talks about something that characterized her person, her essence. All right, so we're looking within this woman as the kind of woman she is. There's also something ambiguous about her. Well, what's ambiguous is not her external appearance, but something about who she is within herself. And then the author goes on to talk about the light of the mind. So what kind of mind are we talking about? A person's being. So the descriptions then of external physical appearance, internal psychology. Also, there's an interest in her age, that she must have been in her 40s, but perhaps that's not that important because she could have been 14 or 400. Nevertheless, it returns to her age down here, her date of birth, and also her birthday, which he thinks was in September. And then one final characteristic to look at is that in this story, the storyteller is a character also, and the storyteller tells the story in the first person. So the storyteller talks about me and I and we, and again, I say, I perhaps mean, I would have known. I have a hazy recollection. So the storyteller is also a character within the story and uses the first person. So these are the kinds of characteristics of modern stories that we're quite familiar with. It doesn't mean that every story, modern story we read, has all of these characteristics. But when we encounter them, we are not surprised, because we frequently read about the physical appearance, the psychology, the thoughts, the motives of characters, their age, and a narrator telling the story in the first person. Now, what I have to say is that of these characteristics that we've just seen, none of them is typical of biblical stories. And so this is just to warn us that if we read Bible stories as if they are modern Western stories, we are likely to head off in the wrong direction as we're reading them. So I'd like to look now at a biblical story. It comes from 1 Kings chapter 19 and concerns the prophet Elijah. I'm going to read it. I'm going to spend a bit of time with this, and then we'll take a look at its characteristics. I've had to condense it a little bit to get it onto one slide. But we're told here that that is Elijah was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba. He went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life. He got up and went 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. By the way, Horeb is another name for Sinai. Okay, there's Sinai. At that place, he came to a cave and spent the night there. And then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." So there's this story then in 1 Kings 19. The first thing to notice is that the storyteller gives us minimal insight. For example, there is no physical description of Elijah. Is Elijah a tall man or short? Is he handsome or plain? Does he stand erect, or is he stooped over? Is his skin complexion fairer or darker? Is his hair straight or curly? We haven't a clue, because the story doesn't tell us. And the story doesn't tell us those things because it has no bearing whatsoever on the story. And then he gives us minimal, explicit psychological analysis. What's going on in Elijah's head? What's he thinking? What are his motives? About the only insight we get is at the very beginning. It says he was afraid. So we've got a general idea of what's going on, but nothing more than that. However, the Bible story writer gives us hints about Elijah's thought processes, motives, and psychology, but he does it indirectly, because basically the information we get here is confined to what Elijah says and what Elijah does. And it's from what he says and what he does that we work out what might be going on. And in those things that I've just mentioned, this makes this a typical Bible story. It doesn't have the details that we normally have in a modern story, but the details it does have are critical for us to understand. And there's one outstanding characteristic of this story, which is also typical of numerous Bible stories and which we frequently misunderstand, and that is the use of repetition. And I'd like to show you the amount of repetition in this account. So, first of all, notice here it says he fled for his life, asked that he might die. Take away my life. They are seeking my life. They are seeking my life. So one thing that's established through that repetition is that this story is a matter of life and death. We'll come back to that. And then God asks a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And you notice that later God repeats exactly the same question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And let's see how Elijah answers. He answered, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Okay. How does he answer God's second question? He says, he answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Do you notice a kind of slight similarity in Elijah's answer? Well, it's not, of course, just a similarity. Both the question by God and the answer by Elijah are repeated word perfect in both places. It's an absolute repetition. And then we have some more repetition. We have wind, wind, wind. And then, of course, there is the earthquake, earthquake, earthquake. And then there is fire, fire, fire. You notice the amount of repetition, but we haven't finished yet because, as we know, but the Lord was not in the wind. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. But the Lord was not in the fire. So, a lot of repetition, and biblical narratives basically repeat that which is important. So for us, we tend to skip over what's repeated because we think it's repetitious and a bit boring, but we're missing the point that what is repeated is what is significant. So let's look at just two examples of what's repeated in this story, and we'll see how the narrative, the story, is inviting us to judge what's going on, using our imagination to look beyond the words. Now, I mentioned that when we have this repetition saying he fled for his life, which in the red font you can see is repeated throughout, this is a story of life and death. It begins by saying he got up and fled for his life. Now, when you flee for your life, you're trying to save your life, right? But then on the second line, he asked that he might die. Take away my life. So hang on a minute. First of all, he wants to save his life. And then he wants to die. I mean, if I was cynical, I would be saying to him, Elijah, why didn't you just stay? If you wanted to die, why didn't you just stay where you were? Where you thought you were going to lose your life. Now, why? Why does Elijah move from wanting to save his life to wanting to die? The story doesn't tell us. Elijah doesn't tell us. The storyteller doesn't tell us. So what could be the reason? Of course, we need to read the story to get through to the heart of the matter. But is it possible then that Elijah is simply confused? He doesn't really know what he wants. Is he, as we might say, is he suffering from depression? So he's not able to think straight in this situation? Or is there some other reason, as we engage with the story, that we can discover why he's acting this way? And then there's, if we come on to God's question, a repeated question, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah gives him this answer. And then later, God asks him the same question, and he gives him the same answer. Now, what purpose does that serve? Because in between Elijah's two answers that you see there in the yellow font, in between those two answers, there is a great wind that's splitting the mountain, an earthquake, and fire. And then God asks him the question again. All right, then, let me repeat the question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he gives him exactly the same answer as before. Is it because he doesn't understand what's just taken place? Could that be the reason? Nothing has happened for him to change his answer. But whatever the answer is, this story is saying, dear reader, why do you think God repeats his question exactly, and then Elijah repeats his answer exactly? We might want to come back to this later on in the discussion period. Now, on the question here that God asks, by the way, what are you doing here, Elijah? In the Hebrew, the emphasis is on here. What are you doing here, Elijah? That's a good question. Why are you on Mount Sinai, Elijah? Because God didn't tell him to go there. Nobody else told him to go there. And we don't know, as readers, where he is going until he gets there. Now, we might say, well, he's running away from Jezebel. Yeah, okay, he's running away from Jezebel, but he could have run to any one of the 4 points of the compass. He could have gone to the Philistines. He could have gone to Jericho. What are you doing here on Mount Sinai, Elijah? So it's a good question. And notice what his answer is. I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they're seeking my life to take it away. And when he's answered God's question, we are none the wiser. He doesn't say, oh, I'm at Sinai because. So he doesn't really answer God's question. And he repeats it as well. Why isn't he answering God's question? Now, this is forcing us to use our intelligence and our imagination to enter the story and try to work out what is going on. Now, I mentioned, and we've looked here at the repetition in this story. And what we have in this account is an example of what's called 3 and 4 repetition. Now, what do I mean by 3 and 4 repetition? Well, let me show you what it is, and then I'll explain it. So in this story, 1, now there was a great wind, but the Lord was not in the wind. 2, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. 3, and after the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. So we get 1, 2, 3 unsuccessful or open-ended repetitions, and then 4. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Then there came a voice. And of course, it is the voice of God. So 3 and 4 repetition is where you go 1, 2, 3, and the issue hasn't been resolved. Because the question in our minds is, well, where is God then? If he's not in the wind, if he's not in the earthquake, he's not in the fire, where is he? He's in the still small voice, or the sound of sheer silence. And this kind of repetition, ironically, is repeated many times in biblical narratives. Let me give you another example quickly from a story I'm sure you know, the story of Samuel and Eli in the sanctuary. 1, then the Lord called Samuel, Samuel, and he said, here I am, and ran to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I didn't call, lie down again. So he went and lay down. 2, the Lord called again, Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I didn't call, my son, lie down again. 3, the Lord called Samuel again, a 3rd time. You notice the storyteller wants us to remember this is the 3rd time. It's the 3rd time, reader. And he got up and went to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. And then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. And therefore Eli said to Samuel, go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. 1, 2, 3, you know what's coming next. 4, now the Lord came and stood there calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. 3 and 4 repetition. I'm going to look at one more example because last week, those of you who were with us last week, you remember Horace gave us a really good presentation on the story of Samson. And we've got another example of 3 and 4 repetition in the story of Samson, if you remember from last week, when Delilah is trying to get the secret of Samson's strength. 1, she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings as a strand of fiber snaps when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. 2, so Delilah said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. 3, then she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. You notice the repetition? The Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pin, the loom, and the web. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And when he awoke from his sleep, he thought, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. 1, 2, 3, and then success on number 4. Notice something here. he thought. Remember what I said before, that biblical stories rarely tell us what people are thinking or what's going through their minds. But when they do, it is always, I repeat, for the sake of repetition, it is always significant. And he thought that he was going to free himself, but he did not know. So there's something else that isn't in his head. He did not know that the Lord had left him. So the fact that the storyteller unusually tells us what's going through or not going through his mind underlines how significant it is. So what we've been looking at so far is repetition within the story of Elijah on Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. But the Bible also uses repetition between one story and another story. Let's see how that works with Elijah here. And we're going to look at the way in which the biblical account of Moses is picked up and repeated in Elijah. So back in Exodus then, Moses went up to Mount Sinai. And in 1 Kings with Elijah went as far as Horeb. Horeb, as I said, just another name for Sinai. So they are both on the same mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Elijah was 40 days and 40 nights getting to Sinai or Horeb. With Moses, God says, I will put you in the cleft of the rock. And with Elijah got to Sinai, and there he went into the cave. Now, most English translations don't give a good translation of this, because they say there Elijah went into a cave. But that isn't what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew here has the definite article, the. Elijah went into the cave, not any old cave, but one cave in particular. And in light of all the other parallels between Elijah and Moses, what I'm arguing here is that Elijah is in that same cleft of the rock that Moses was in when he went up Mount Sinai. He is in the cave, that cave. And with Moses on Sinai, God says to him, be in the cleft of the rock while my glory passes by. And with Elijah, the Lord tells him, the Lord is about to pass by. Same verb. Let's look at a little bit more on this. Moses and Elijah. With Moses in Exodus, the whole mountain shook violently. The Lord descended upon it in fire, and Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. And with Elijah, in the same cave, on the same mountain, what is repeated? There was an earthquake. What's an earthquake? Well, it's when the earth shakes violently, all right? There was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. With Moses, the Lord descended upon it in fire. After the earthquake, a fire. Aha! Repeated. But, and this is where we get a twist in the story, a twist in the repetition between Moses and Elijah. But the Lord was not in the fire. But of course, the Lord had been in the fire with Moses. The Lord descended upon it in fire. And then finally, after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. Still small voice. Not the thunder that Moses had, but sheer silence. So there are numerous repetitions, but there's a twist at the end. And when this kind of repetition occurs with a deviation or twist at the end, this is emphasizing something significant about the second narrative. And so we have to use our imagination to say, what is that significance? Because the storyteller doesn't tell us. He tells us what is said and what is done, but does not give the motivation or move beyond that significance. So so why then, coming back to God's question, what are you doing here, Elijah? I'm going to give you my take on the story here. Why has Elijah gone from Mount Carmel? He's just been on Mount Carmel, where he defeated the prophets of Baal. He's traveled all the way through Israel, all the way through Judah, across the boundary at the southern tip of Judah, and trekked for miles and miles through the Arabian desert to get to Sinai. Why is he off to Sinai? Because I think it becomes clear, reading between the lines, using the imagination, at least using my imagination, it's because Elijah wants to repeat the experience of Moses. Elijah's had one mountaintop experience on Mount Carmel, when fire descended on that sacrifice. And he's off to Sinai to experience what Moses experienced with God. But it doesn't happen. There is no fire which represents God. There is no thunder, because God has moved on. We are at a critical point in the way in which the Old Testament represents God. The fire that came down and consumed the sacrifice on Carmel is the last time God displays his power, signs and wonders before all Israel. He never does it again. Let me just underline that with this other comparison. We're going to compare 1 Kings 18, 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 18, Elijah is on top of Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. 1 Kings 19, he's on top of Sinai with the Lord. 1 Kings 18, this is what Elijah said. The God who answers by fire is indeed God. What happens? The fire of the Lord fell. And what did the people say when they saw the fire of the Lord? The Lord indeed is God. So that's Carmel. You come the very next story, 1 Kings 19. We've already looked at the previous context, and it says here, but the Lord was not in the fire. Well, the Lord had certainly been in the fire on top of Mount Carmel just a few days before. He'd certainly been in the fire then, but not now. And in terms of doing things before Israel, never again. So we've reached a critical point in the history of Israel, and the repetition underlines it. So before Carmel, God is loud and brash. After Carmel, he becomes more subtle and understated. Or as I sometimes say, before Carmel, God is an American. After Carmel, he is an Englishman. But this repetition isn't simply confined within stories in the Old Testament or between Old Testament stories. It's picked up and repeated in the New Testament as well. So if we come to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, let's look at this. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. And then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And while he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." So here we are in the New Testament, Matthew's Gospel, and we are now on top of another mountain. We are with Jesus and some disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. And who should be there but Moses and Elijah, 2 characters who've also been on the top of a mountain. Moses on top of Mount Sinai and Elijah on top of Mount Sinai. We've got them plus Jesus and some disciples on top. And what happens on this mountain in Matthew repeats something of what was the experience of Moses and Elijah on the mountain back in the Old Testament. So look at Exodus 34. Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he'd been talking with God. And on the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus was transfigured before them, and his face shone. You see how the stories of mountaintop experiences with God from Exodus with Moses is now being repeated in the story of Christ in the gospel. And something else which binds these stories together through repetition is the voice on the mountain. With Moses, Moses would speak and God would answer him in thunder. Then with Elijah on Horeb, that is Sinai, after the fire, a still small voice. And then with Christ on Mount of Transfiguration, a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. Hear him." So with Moses, Elijah, and Christ, a divine voice is heard on top of the mountain. But whereas with Moses, it is thunder. With Elijah, it's a still small voice or silence. And with Christ, it's a voice with a different kind of message. So this use of repetition between stories is inviting us to see the progress, the move. So Elijah doesn't just reproduce Moses, and Christ doesn't just reproduce Elijah or Moses. Each has its own voice to give, but God is not static. There's a dynamic move from Moses to Elijah and to Christ. And so we have to engage with these stories imaginatively. Each of these stories sheds light on the others. And if we read them in isolation, then we impoverish our reading. So what I'm trying to do here is to show you just some characteristics of biblical stories. We've spent time on what it doesn't do and a bit of time on what it does do, which is repetition. There are many other things we could look at. Time doesn't allow. What I'd like to move on to now is to look at a way in which some biblical stories are told. Okay, I see some people have got their hands raised, but I don't know whether that's because something is not working or...
No, you may continue.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I'd just like to give you an example of one type of Bible story. There are many different types, and I just, as an example of imaginative biblical storytelling, and we'll look at this before we conclude here. And what I'd like to look at are sandwich stories. Now, I know that sounds like an odd title. The first time I saw it, I thought it was going to tell me something about church potlucks, sandwich stories. But what a sandwich story is, as we look at the biblical text, is this. Story A starts. So we kick off with a story. It begins and we get some initial points in the story. But then story B interrupts story A, and story B continues until it is finished. And once story B has come to an end, then story A resumes and goes through until it has finished. I'm going to, first of all, to briefly show you how this works in one story, and then we'll look at another story in a little bit more detail. It's a bit easier to follow. So we're going to look at this Mark chapter 5, 21 to 43. Now, Mark is one biblical writer who uses quite a few sandwich stories. I think at least 9 of them in his gospel, but it occurs elsewhere as well. And you get sandwich stories in the Old Testament too. So this is a familiar passage. So just quickly, story A starts. A leader of the synagogue called Jairus approaches Jesus from the crowd and asks him to come to his home and heal his daughter. And Jesus agrees. But then story B interrupts as Jesus is on his way. And there's a woman in the crowd who suffers from chronic bleeding. And she believes she can be healed if she just touches Jesus. She touches him and is healed, and Jesus speaks and reflects on the matter as well. So story B interrupts. It begins and goes until story B finishes. Then story A resumes. News arrives that Jairus' daughter has died, but Jesus goes to the home and raises her. So you can see the sandwich here, right? So story A here, and story A resuming here. Those are the 2 slices of bread. And story B is the cheese in the sandwich. All right, that's why it's called a sandwich story. Now, what frequently happens, not always, but what frequently happens in sandwich stories is that the relationship between the bread and the cheese is enlightening, throws up connections between the slices of bread, if you like, and the cheese. Let me explain this from the story of Jairus as it begins. Story A, Jairus shows faith in Christ's power. He comes to Jesus and says, can you come and heal my daughter? Story B, well, the woman shows faith in Christ's power. She says, if only I touch him, I can be healed. So we have a comparison here between Jairus and the woman. Jairus, remember, a man of high social status. He's the leader of the synagogue. This woman, anonymous woman, probably of low status, or at least because of her condition, she's going to be considered unclean. So the same, but also very different. And then, well, blow me down. This woman has been suffering for 12 years, we're told. And Jairus's daughter is 12 years old. So this woman's suffering began when Jairus's daughter was born. She's been suffering for as long as Jairus's daughter has been alive. So this is inviting us, dear reader, compare and contrast and see the connections between the woman and the girl. The woman is unclean because of her flow of blood. That would make her unclean ritually in the Levitical, according to Levitical law. And of course, Jairus's daughter is unclean. Well, that is, she's unclean because she died, a corpse, which is unclean. The woman is healed. Jairus's daughter is healed. Jairus calls his daughter, not surprisingly, my little daughter. When they speak to Jairus later, they say, your daughter is dead. But when Jesus speaks to the woman, he calls her daughter. Your faith has made you well. So again, the woman and the girl, both referred to as daughter, inviting us as readers to make connections between these two. How does one provide insight into the other? Are you reading carefully, dear reader? In story B, in the cheese and the sandwich here, the disciples can't believe Christ's statement because Jesus says, who touched me? And Jesus is in this crush of a crowd, and the disciples say, what do you mean? Who touched me? Can't you see the crowd all around you? And in story A, when it resumes, the people there can't believe Christ's statement either, because Jesus says, she is not dead, she's only sleeping. And they say, what do you mean? She's only sleeping. So yes, we have a story A, that's interrupted by story B, but there are interconnections between these stories which are inviting us to read the two together imaginatively. I can remember as a young intern wanting to preach a sermon on the story of Jairus's daughter. And it was so frustrating because this woman turns up and interrupts the story. And I'm not interested in the woman. I want to preach a sermon on Jairus's daughter. Well, of course, little did I know at the time that if only I'd realized this is a sandwich story, I would have realized that looking at the story of Jairus's daughter without including the woman in it means I'm not really reading the story as Mark intends us to read it. Okay. I'm going to finish by looking at another sandwich story. And the reason for doing this is that I can get this one on one slide and I can take you through this slowly as we see how this unfolds. This again comes from Mark. It's Mark 14, 1 to 11. It was 2 days before the Passover, the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. So there is this story, these 11 verses. And let's first of all consider how this is a sandwich story. Where are the slices of bread and where's the filling? You might have been able to see that as we were reading through, but this is how I would see it. So the red at the top and bottom are the slices of bread, and the green font is the filling. Here we've got the news about what the priests and scribes want to do and wanting to kill Jesus. And then down here, we have the chief priests again with Judas. And in between, we have the story of the woman who enters the house and pours this expensive ointment on Jesus. That is so at the top here in red, this is story A begins, and then the green is story B interrupts and then goes to its completion, and then the red font again is the story A resuming and going to completion. So you could miss out everything in green and just read what is red, followed by the second lot of red font, and it would seem to hold together perfectly well as a self-contained story. Now, what are some of the connections between the two parts of this story, and how might that encourage us to imaginatively enter this story when we see the comparisons and contrasts? These are some that I picked up as I was preparing to do this for this presentation. You notice here in story B that this ointment is very costly. It's worth more than 300 denarii. A denarius was a day's wage for a manual laborer. So it's 300 days' wages for a laborer. So it's a lot of money. More than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor. The money given to the poor, yeah. But then, of course, down here, we have money being given to somebody else to give him money. And him is Judas. Story A begins by talking about the desire of the chief priests to kill him. And down here, Jesus says, she's anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Well, of course, you bury the dead. And so there's this connection between story A and story B. In story B, you have anger. They saw what she did and they spoke to one another in anger. They scolded her for doing this to Jesus. But of course, down in story A, when it resumes, quite a contrast here. They are greatly pleased, because now they know they've got Jesus. They've got the insider. And so you see the contrast between what makes people angry and what pleases them. So the parts of this sandwich story, beginning the comparisons and contrasts, we're beginning to make connections and, I suggest, enriching and making the story more complex than just a simple account. In story A, we're told that they want to arrest Jesus, finding a way to do it by stealth. By stealth. That is, secretly, underhandedly, in the background where nobody can see what they're doing. And that what they are doing, or wanting to do by stealth, contrasts with what Jesus is doing in story B. He's sitting at table in somebody's house with a crowd of people. He's in a public place. He's engaging publicly with people, not underhandedly, not in the background. So there's the secrecy of the enemies and there's the public persona of Jesus. We have, of course, the chief priests and scribes here in story A, and that's repeated in story B. That's, fairly obvious balance between the two. And these priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus. They're looking for a way to arrest Jesus. And down here, Judas began to look, you notice the language, began to look for an opportunity, began to look for a way to betray him. What they want to do here is going to be achieved by what we read down there. And perhaps this is hinted generally, but I think it's fairly explicit too. Jesus says of this woman, she has performed a good service for me. She has performed a good service for me. While Judas wishes to betray him, hardly doing Christ a good service. So another contrast between the actions and ambitions of Judas and the actions of the woman. So when we see this sandwich story, is simply an example of how some biblical stories are told. We see that simple stories become much more complex and interesting and raise more questions than if we simply treat them as an account of what happened. Biblical stories habitually give us more than just factual information, just data. They were created by authors with imagination, and we need to read them with imagination. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Turner. That was well said, well presented as usual. And we definitely appreciate the time you've taken to go through with us this afternoon. Just to share for those who want to join the conversation, we already have a couple of persons who have raised their hands, but for the rest of you, it is time for you to raise your hand to join the conversation. And again, if you're not sure where that is, should be somewhere to the bottom right of your screen within the reactions that you should see the option to raise your digital hand. We ask when you join the conversation to stick to the topic and to make your questions short so that we can allow other persons to participate. I've also noticed that there are a few persons who have signed in without using their names, and we're going to ask you that you change whether it says iPhone or whatever it says to your actual name to help us differentiate you from any unwelcome guests who may want to join, and so that we can recognize you as we go throughout the conversation today. So Horace has had his hand up for some time, so I will allow Horace to begin and to ask the first question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sherry Ann. And thank you, Laurence. That was a beautiful, elegant, textual analysis. I really am fascinated by that. Thank you so much for that approach. You pointed out many interesting things that, by the way, the sandwich stories, I find that very fascinating because I was reading the story of Joseph recently, and right smack dab in the story of Joseph in chapter 38 of Genesis, we have this story of Tamar that had seemingly nothing to do with Joseph at all. But as we shall, well, maybe later we'll get into that, but that was a beautiful sandwich story as well. Mm-hmm. But now my question is, the repetitive elements and the parallel elements that you've pointed out, we know that the written scriptures were preceded by an oral tradition most often. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that these repetitive elements are there to facilitate oral transmission and to maintain the oral tradition before these stories were committed to writing? Or were these simply coincidental repetitions?
Yes, I mean, you make a good point. And by the way, Joseph is a good example of another sandwich story, chapter 37, 38, and 39. It's a straightforward sandwich story. Yes, I was going to say a little bit about this question of oral storytelling, but I realized I didn't have time. So thank you for raising it as a question. Yes, I think that the repetition in biblical stories is frequently, at least, evidence that these were stories that were originally told orally, because any of us who preach or teach or speak to a group of people know the importance of repetition. Just because we say something once doesn't mean that they're going to get it. I used to teach I still do teach a bit of homiletics, and I remind people who are preachers that just because we have a message is no guarantee that people will get the message. So you have to, and when you're presenting it orally, repetition is an important part of it. So one way of looking at it is, I suppose, because these stories were originally presented orally, and what do you repeat when you are telling a story orally? You repeat what is significant for the story, and you don't confuse people with material that is irrelevant for the story. Right. So in that novel that I read from at the beginning, there it says the woman had dark hair, and he thinks her birthday was in September. Those details never appear again anywhere in the novel. They are irrelevant for the plot development and everything else. But you've got to fill in the background. That's our convention. You've got to fill in the background so people can see it and appreciate it. But when you're telling a brief story orally, you tend to get rid of everything that is not relevant and repeat what is. So, yeah, I think it's a reminder to us that many of these stories were first orally presented.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Horace, for that. It's a really good question. Lauren, it is your turn to join the conversation.
And another fantastic class. So good. Uh, yeah, I should have guessed that Horace would have jumped in and asked my question. I was going to ask the same question. Was this done intentionally, or I tend to believe that a lot of the Bible was composed rather than just written down intentionally. So I'm supposing probably whoever put it together did it intentionally. It seems to be the import of your question. I thought about when you're talking about repetition, I thought about something that I found years ago that was very interesting. My friend Karen Petoskey, who's on here, will remember this. We had come to Stanford University, a group of artists, carvers, wood carvers from Papua New Guinea. They were doing the anthropology department there was doing a garden of South Pacific totem poles, and a couple of them were Seventh Adventists, and they came to church. And at church, I introduced them, and I had them read some portions of their Bible. And I have since discovered that this notion of repetition is not just in terms of large stories, but in terms of words in Creoles and pidgin, what we would call pidgin languages. For example, in the English, I remember this one in the English for the John 3:16. It said that Jesus loved them well, which meant he really loved them. Not just he loved them well, he loved them really well, because he repeated the word and that made it stronger. So I thought about that when you were talking about repetition, that this seems to be a natural thing. And I don't think that we recognize that enough in the Bible stories. Let me ask you just one more question. We Seventh Adventists really love our apocalyptic passages. Does the same thing, I find Revelation, for example, a confusing mishmash. And I'm always skeptical when people say, oh, I've decoded it all. I know exactly what Revelation means. And if you take this and compare it to this, and I mean, I find it has no narrative, no time structure whatsoever. And I'm very skeptical about Revelation. Do understanding these structures of stories in the Bible, could they help us make sense out of the apocalyptic books as well?
Right. Okay. Well, some people, as you suggested, may think so. However, I think that the Bible contains many genres. You know, we have narrative or story, we have genealogies and proverbs and psalms, and you know, a whole gamut of things. So, what is true of stories might not be true of the Book of Revelation. And one of the things about apocalyptic is frequently a contrast is made between apocalyptic and, let's say, Old Testament prophets or other prophets. Like when you read the prophet Amos, you know that this is something that he was saying out on the streets. You know, he was delivering it. Hear these words, you cows of Bashan, who ask your husbands to bring you wine. And, you know, he's mocking the high celebrity society of his time. So the prophets were preachers. So they were presenting things orally. Mm-hmm. But it's often felt that apocalyptic is not oral, but rather written. Because you imagine somebody on the street corner starting off by saying, and I saw a great beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and on each horn there was a diadem, and there was a woman. And I said, hang on a minute, hang on. How many beasts were there? How many heads? It's difficult to pick that up on the hoof, you know. It's the sort of thing that you need to have written. So it's often said that apocalyptic is more of a written genre, whereas prophecy and storytelling is more of an oral genre. Now, that might not be held by all, but I think there's some truth in that. So because we see it in one kind of literature, we can't apply it across the board. Of course, you can't do it the other way, you know, where we take a parable or we take a narrative and we convert it into an apocalyptic prophecy. You know, the Millerites did that with Nebuchadnezzar's, you know, the 7 times of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4. And surprise, surprise, they got to 1844, right? No, because Daniel 4 is not an apocalyptic prophecy, it's a narrative. And you can't apply the same rules to different genres. So I think what we've been looking at is something not necessarily peculiar to narrative, because as I said, prophets, I think, were preached orally, but you just can't apply it across the board, I don't think.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I would love to. I think probably Dr. Tonstad came as close to doing a good analysis of Revelation as anyone has. But for the most part, I have generally been rather discouraged by the attempts of Adventists to try to make sense of Revelation. So I'm just glad to know that I'm not the only one who has struggled.
But the other thing about it, what made the book of Revelation quite different for me was the first time I remember I sat down and I read Revelation from beginning to end in one go. And so I wasn't stopping, wanting to analyze what every beast and every hoof was. And I got a completely different view of the book, reading it just from beginning to end, the impressionistic view rather than analyzing every full stop and semicolon.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I have tried to tell Adventists from time to time that when you are told we Adventists really know Revelation, just keep in mind that they will pick out probably at most and study probably at most 1/4 of the book and interpret it for you. If they're gonna say, oh, the churches, and churches are pretty obvious. They're easy. They're preachable, all on their own. They're going to do a little work on 13 and 14 and 20 and 21. And there you've got, oh, we understand Revelation. And you ask them, well, what about those trumpets? I have never heard anyone give a coherent version of the trumpets. So yeah, it's not as though we have grasped all of it. We use little bits of it. That's my impression.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And I jotted down a question, and if your question just now kind of triggered me to ask that question now, Dr. Turner. So you spoke about reading the Bible imaginatively. What do you say to those who are skeptical in terms of taking that approach of examining the narratives imaginatively? Those who only want to accept a literal reading of the text. I think they miss so much of the beauty in the way that the stories are told. But how do you share with them that there is a lot of additional information and a lot of communication between the divine and us if we are able to look at not just the literal text and expecting everything to be historically accurate, but looking at how things are written, how they've been composed. I like that word that you had used, Lauren, and then extracting from that the lessons that the word. How do you share with a skeptic who's like, oh, you know, you may be treading on dangerous territory to look at the Bible that way?
Yeah, well, one of the things, of course, is that within Adventism, there can be a fairly, well, we do have a fairly well-established tradition of not dealing well with literature. We're suspicious of it. And we think that we are undermining the truth of the Bible. But that's because, we confuse factuality with truth. The only way I know of doing it is to unpack some Bible stories and get people to see how wonderful they can be. And it works sometimes. I remember once I did that, and afterwards this fellow came up to me and said, "Do you have visions?" He thought that I had some kind of prophetic gift, that I'd seen these things in the Bible stories. All I was doing was just using straightforward approaches to the text. Everybody's different, but I would say in general, if we can show that the Bible is interesting, and for too many people it isn't interesting, it's a complex compendium of truth, which if we understand it correct, will get us through the judgment. But is the Bible interesting? Well, no, it's not supposed to be interesting. It's supposed to be the Word of God. And I would say it is the Word of God, and it's also intensely interesting if you know how to read it. I wouldn't put it this way, but basically what we need is reading competence, to know what we're reading and how to read it. And then a whole new world opens up. And some people are open to that. They're persuadable.
All right, thanks. Making the Bible interesting and looking at it that way. I really like that. Gerald, asking you to unmute so you can join the conversation.
Thank you, Cherry Ann. You raised the point that I was going to bring up, and I'll just perhaps extend it slightly. Laurence, I really appreciate your presentation, as it adds so much depth, at least in potential, to anything that I've read previously. Now, I asked the question in the chat, can we, by adding the results of our imagination, erroneously disturb the story and its intended effects? Now, let me qualify that. I often tell the children's story for our church, and today was no exception. And today I told the story of the little boy who fed everybody lunch. But I didn't say that. I gave the story from the perspective of the child and his mother, who, true to her calling of being a mother, insisted that her son take a lunch for what she anticipated him being a long afternoon. And I impugned that he was probably the only one who had a lunch. And further, that at the end of the story, he came home with the same lunch. And his mother accused him of not having eaten his lunch. He was going to get too skinny for his health. But instead, I had him open his lunch bag and reveal that he brought home from the Feast of the 5,000 a tuna fish sandwich. Mm-hmm. So do we add too much to these stories, or do we make them more human and rich for our children and youth?
Yes, well, in some ways, what you did is a traditional Jewish approach to biblical story. And what you gave really was a midrash. You embroidered around the biblical story.
Right.
But the point of embroidering around the biblical story was so that we can see something of what's in the story, but in a new light. Was it the intention of the biblical author to present precisely what you gave the children in church today? I doubt whether it's precisely that.
Right.
Nevertheless, what you gave was a midrash, which is a story You know, sometimes in a movie or something, you say this was inspired by a true story, you know, but it's got some invented fact. So
Yeah.
letting you know. So it depends on how you tell it. You know, if you tell it as the gospel truth, and unless this is included as the 29th fundamental belief of the Adventist Church, then I'm going to, you know, take my membership down to the local Methodist Church or something like that. But that's the sort of thing that stories can inspire. So you're going beyond the story, but
Yes.
you're not saying something which is totally irrelevant to the story, and you're relating it because the gospel story is not written primarily for children. And
Yes.
what you did was to retell it for children. So I don't
Yeah.
see anything wrong in that.
So can the
And I
Holy
think we should have
Spirit,
a bit more midrash, you know.
yes, can the Holy Spirit influence my midrash as well as the original author in telling the story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that even midrash is anchored in the biblical account.
Clearly.
It isn't just plucked out of thin air. And as long as we recognize it for what it is, an imaginative embroidery of an original idea in the Bible, and we're not saying that this is exegesis of
Right.
the story, but it's a development of the story. What we're doing is we're repeating, I would think, the imaginative impulse that we find in these biblical stories. And we're seeing that imaginative impulse in the retelling of stories inspired by it.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll have to qualify my future stories as this is the midrash. This is not gospel. Well, it is gospel.
It is gospel, yes. It has good news. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for that imaginative question. Dr. Furton, it's over to you to join the conversation.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Laurence, for the seminar this afternoon and what you presented. I'm always amazed at things we can learn from Scripture, the narrative, the stories, and you've got a way of presenting things that is so enhancing and beautiful. It's just amazing to learn new things, and Scripture is just full of it. My question has already been kind of implied a little bit by Sherry Ann and a couple of comments on that I've been doing in the chat. There are a couple books in the Bible, the book of Jonah and the book of Job. And I wonder to what extent, if we were to understand as literature, as storytelling, from perhaps that perspective, instead of taking them to be very, very literal stories with all the little details really, really happened, if we would perhaps get a different meaning out of the book, out of these stories, if we were to read them with imagination instead of being very literalistic about them, would that help us? Would there be meaning arising out of those stories? I'm just interested to know what you'd think here.
Yes, well, with Jonah, Jonah is one of the best biblical stories, you know, just from a literary point of view. And it has plays on words and all kinds of things going through it. So if you miss out on all of that, your reading is impoverished, and we miss out on the challenge of the book of Jonah. So I would say, let's mine the book of Jonah for all the joy and the literary finesse that it includes, so that we can, as we read it, smile as we read it. You know, we see, oh, that is clever. Let me just give you one example. Jonah preaches his sermon. It's only 5 words in Hebrew. And I know there are some church members who would delight if their pastor preached sermons of a similar length, you know, but his sermon in the book is only 5 words in Hebrew. In 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. Well, that's how it's translated. In 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. But the word for destroyed, as people will say, it's the same word that's used to describe the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So everybody knows what's going to happen then. And not only that, but of course, Nineveh isn't destroyed. So big theological question. How can a prophet of God give a prophecy that isn't fulfilled? And then we go into the mode of saying, yes, well, every prophecy of doom is implicitly, it's calling on people to repent. Well, what the word that Jonah uses has two meanings. And it means to overturn in the sense of destroy, but it also means to turn around in the sense of convert. He has converted our sorrow into joy. Uses the same word. So, dear reader, when you first read it, you thought that the Hebrew word is hafak. When you first read it, dear reader, you thought hafak meant destroy, didn't you? In 40 days, Nineveh will be overturned. Well, in less than 40 days, Nineveh was turned around. It was converted. So, which meaning of the word would you prefer to have happened to the Ninevites? That's the kind of question that God asks at the end. Shouldn't I have pity on Nineveh? So I just give that just as an example to show that the book was written with a great deal of imagination and is not written as a 21st century script for a documentary on ancient Nineveh. And so we enter into the story and see connections and important theological points that we would miss. I mean, I talked about Elijah. Jonah is presented as a parody of the prophet Elijah. Now, Elijah sits under a tree and he wants to die. Jonah sits under a tree and he wants to die. The problem is that Elijah wants to die because the people haven't listened. Jonah wants to die because the people did listen. So the story from beginning to end is poking fun. And if you're too serious about exegesis and theology, you don't see humor. I mean, we don't see humor anywhere, I think, in the 28 fundamentals. Not that that's where I would expect to find humor, but we do find humor in the biblical stories. And it's through humor that serious points are made. And we get a lot more out of Jonah and Job if we were to see that.
Thank you so much for that. And I do believe God has a sense of humor. I'm sure I give him jokes all the time.
Yes, yes. Yes.
So, Dr. Martin, you had your hand up before and you've rejoined the queue. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Today I was in the brick and mortar, but I still could not afford to miss having Dr. Turner. And Dr. Turner really enjoyed the presentation. It was really insightful, especially for a non-theologian, very insightful. So, in regular literature, we have different styles. One of those who was fortunate to study British literature also, and we have the iambic pentameter, and we have other structures in storytelling and poems. Regarding the New Testament and Jesus' parables, is there anything you can tell us with respect to traditions or the nature of the storytelling or the structure of the stories or the lessons from the stories? Is there anything you can offer regarding the New Testament and Christ's parables and the like?
Well, what I would say is that the sorts of things that I was talking about in these stories that I mentioned are also true in principle when Jesus tells longer parables. So you have parable of the prodigal son, the good Samaritan, the wise and foolish bridesmaids or virgins. So when you get a parable which is long enough to be narrative-like, then you get the same kinds of things in those parables. But there are some things that are peculiar to parables as a kind of a subset, of narrative. I notice Dr. Johnston has his hand up, and he's an expert on parables. So he could tell us more about that in particular. But Jesus shows imaginative insight in the way in which he tells his parables. So in principle, what I've said about the stories is also true with Jesus and the parables. Even the short parables show imagination, but they're not always story-like in form.
All right, thanks so much for that question. Ed Dickerson, you are next, inviting you to unmute and join the conversation. Ed, I see that you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Okay, while you're trying to figure
Ed, you work that out,
out.
and we'll come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go.
Oh, I think I just heard you.
Okay, now we can hear
Yeah,
you.
we're hearing you now.
You hear me? I switched the mic. It's never mind. I'm without my regular software. And anyway, I just want to thank you, Dr. Turner. I make a special pains to make sure I'm going to listen when you're on here. So I find you very rewarding. And I've spent a lot of my time working on scripture as narrative. And I was interested. I've got a very technical question, and then a couple of things I'd like to run past you. The one is the article said that the Bible is 40% narrative. I've seen statistics of 75 or 80, and I don't have a dog in the fight. I just want to be right.
Yeah, on that question, the percentage of the Bible, that is narrative, it's clear, with many narratives, it's clear they're narratives, and then there are some where people wonder whether is it narrative or is it just simply prose.
Sure.
40% is usually the figure given. It can be slightly more than that, but that's the normal figure. So more than a third of the Bible as a whole, Old and New Testament.
I just want to be accurate when I share this. One of the things that maybe this is something you're talking about, I found that people, because we have chapters and verses, people tend to read vertically rather than horizontally, especially in apocalyptic. So we study Daniel 2 and we study Daniel 7, but we don't see a connection between the two. And there's a whole narrative going on there that makes it's clear when you understand the narrative. Dr. Shea did a lot of this on the chiasm of 2 through 7. And so you have the vision of Nebuchadnezzar and the vision of Daniel, the same vision, different symbols used. You have the mortal threat to the 3 Hebrew worthies in 3, and the threat to Daniel in 6. People say, where was Daniel when they were thrown in the fiery furnace? Well, in a literary sense, he's in the lion's den. Not in a chronological sense, but in a literary sense. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing he said is not primarily written for children. And when I was writing my book for such a time where I used this approach to women who took the initiative in the Bible, I found that most people, and myself included, tend to relate to Bible stories the way we first heard them as children. And that often we don't go any further than that. That's it. That's what this means, and I don't see any more to it.
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, I just want to say that we underestimate and misunderstand the power of narrative, because as someone who does write a lot, One of the things that writers talk about is the willing suspension of disbelief. And so if you're going to present the gospel, present something that people are not accepting, if you present it simply as logic, you may have a great deal of difficulty. And but if they enter into the story, there's a willing suspension of disbelief. And I think the primary example of this is when Nathan goes to David to tell him, you're in a lot of trouble. You really messed up here, because he doesn't talk about what David did. He talks about the ewe lamb.
Yeah.
And so he connects with David the shepherd to show him what David the king has done.
Yes, I mean, there's been a lot of interesting research done that shows that stories, narratives, are more effective in persuading people to reconsider their position than logical argumentation. And studied on that not long ago in Great Britain, on what have been somewhat controversial issues in society here, including things like same-sex marriage or immigration and that sort of thing. And they found that narrative was more effective in getting people to reconsider their opinion than logical argumentation. And I think there's something there that we can think about, is that normally when we're trying to persuade people of the truth of Adventism, for example, it's showing them how logical and rational it is. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should try to do it irrationally, but we might be more effective if we did it through a different medium, and if we were able to reconfigure what we do in a more narrative way. I think that might, or more appealing to aesthetics, not just to the intellect.
All right, thank you so much, Ed, for that question and the reflections, Dr. Turner. Dr. Johnson, we're now inviting you to unmute and join the conversation.
Thank you for an outstanding presentation. It occurred to me that you have demonstrated how the way biblical stories are constructed is very much like how great music is composed. I think perhaps musicians could identify with what you did and understand it better than systematic theologians. For example, the sandwich stories are obviously a rondo form, and the other more elaborate one, where Moses carries over to Elijah, which carries over to Christ, is like a great symphony with many leitmotifs, and the three installments are like three movements. So my question is, how is this related to typology, or is it related? And by the way, I admire your mastery of PowerPoint.
Well, yeah, I've been thinking about that question a bit myself, about, what has traditionally been labeled typology, and what goes with it. Because I've met individuals who are very strong on typology, and they generally don't like what I do with the biblical text. But it seems to me that what has been called typology, so you have, a person or an event in the past, which is predictive of something in the future or foreshadows something in the future. This may be more along the analogy you drew about the stories and music, like the movements of a symphony, where we move from one movement to another. There are obvious connections, and what you've heard before, you're likely to hear again in a different form later on. I think that's a bit more dynamic than the traditional definition of typology. I don't know what you think. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, it is different, I think. But on a superficial level, a lot of people would be reminded of typology, I think. But
Yeah, it's looking at it's looking at similar. It's looking at
yeah.
similar points in the text, and it's drawing similar conclusions.
In other words, could you say Moses was a type of Elijah, or Elijah was a type of Christ? It seems a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, it all depends on how you define the word type. And I think that's one of the problems with typology. It is a bit slippery in its application. So I'd rather not have it, as you say, it's a bit of a stretch to make that as a fixed, this is a fixed type. And as people normally take that as like a prediction and a fulfillment, you know. I know that isn't always used in typology, but at grassroots level, that's often how typology is conceived, as prediction and fulfillment. And
what's the meaning, Dr. Johnston? What's the meaning? They'll sometimes speak of type and anti-type, and it always rather eluded me what all the implications of that were.
Well, sometimes it's the idea that events cast their shadows ahead of them, but you get into trouble sometimes. For example, Hosea's prophecy about Israel, saying, out of Egypt I've called my son, is used by Matthew to see how Christ and Joseph's and Mary's sojourn in Egypt was a fulfillment of what Hosea prophesied. But Hosea goes on to say, the more I called them, the more they turned from me. It only works if you take it out of context.
Yes, and I think that, well, also on that particular point, I think that in Matthew, I mean, you're a better expert than I am on Matthew's gospel, but it seems to me that the word, this is that which was to fulfill so and so, we sometimes assume what fulfillment means and assume it's a simple prediction fulfillment. But I think the way in which it's done and the vocabulary used shows that isn't necessarily what's going on.
That's right. That's right. I think we try to impose our modern concepts upon ancient writers, and they don't fit. They often don't fit.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Dr. Johnson. And that's why it's good to have those of you who've studied the ancient writers to help to elucidate the rest of us in terms of the differences and what to expect when we go to the text. Mike, it is now time for you to unmute and join the conversation.
Yes. Hello, Laurence. Thank you so much for this. You did mention that the Bible uses repetition. I have to say that this was a repeating experience for me, bringing me back into class, sitting and listening to you. So I hope that it's getting now better into my head as well. So thank you for that.
But at least you attended today.
Yes. I'm just wondering about one thing. It has a little bit to do with what Sherry Ann said. I think it was Sherry Ann, if I'm correct. I feel that we got a little bit lazy in reading and studying the Bible, especially as Adventists. We do have a lesser light shining onto the bigger light, or prophet, or whatever you want to call it. And then, we read her interpretation of the stories, and then that's it, full stop. And I sometimes feel that, that's a bit problematic, especially when looking at stories, and, we was mentioned very briefly the Genesis 38 story, Joseph. It's one of my favorite, and I know your point on that very well, because we have talked about it so many times. And I'm actually completely agreeing with you on all of that. And I do find that there is sometimes this, you know, what the story brings out of Joseph and of his character, especially when he deals with his brothers, is not compatible, to use it like that, with what Ellen White speaks about him, where, you know, she's really portraying the view that he's so above the whole scenery and trying to test his brothers, just to find out if they are still the same. When we read the story, we really get a completely different emotional feeling to the whole thing. And this is what I'm a bit worried and wondering, how do we free ourselves, with respect to what Ellen White has written, to all of those commentaries to the stories and characters of the Bible? How do we still free ourselves to also give the Bible a chance and say, okay, well, and then how do we deal with that discrepancy between what she wrote and what I'm finding out when I read the Bible and studying it? And I do find that most people are just lazy, say, I'm not questioning my view and I'm not seeing what you're seeing because Ellen White is very clear on this and full stop, and that's it. And then the whole conversation stops. And when you are then saying, well, then suddenly, oh, are you against Ellen White?
Yeah.
And then the discussion becomes a different dynamic.
Yes. I think one of the problems, I think the problem is not so much Ellen White herself, but what she has been, what she has become over the decades, since she died. If we were to say to somebody quite bluntly, is Ellen White the inerrant interpreter of the Bible? I think most people would say, well, no, I don't think I'd say that. Now, of course, I think I know some people who would say, yes, I think she is. But it is a bit of a bind. Let me give you an experience, personal experience. So I was asked, along with quite a few other people, to contribute to a fairly big project, publishing project that the church has ongoing. And so we were told, everything that you say, everything that you write must be supported from the biblical text. Not from Ellen White, but it must be supported from the biblical text. But do not write anything which contradicts anything that Ellen White said. Now, that's a bit of a difficult circle to square. If everything has to be decided from Scripture, but what is decided from Scripture must always agree with what Ellen White said, one could ask, why bother reading Scripture in the first place? It'd save yourself a lot of time. And I think that's a bit of a problem that we haven't fully got an answer for, that isn't going to raise people's eyebrows in Sabbath school class if we attempt to give primacy to the Bible. So well, let me give you just one example. Well, not an example, just a sub-point of what I've been saying. I was working on a biblical book of quite a few chapters. And, I got to a chapter that I had to write on, only to discover that Ellen White never mentioned it anywhere in any of her writings. So I can categorically say that my comments on that chapter were not influenced one iota by what Ellen White said. But it was a bit of a relief to realize that that was the case. I think we need to admit that we have given Ellen White more weight in deciding the interpretation of the Bible than we should have. I won't go any further than that.
All right, thank you so much, Mike, for that question. And Lauren, you are back in the queue, so I'll allow you to unmute and ask your next question.
Oh, thank you very much. Since I spoke before, why don't you go ahead with Ed and Art first?
Okay, sure. No problem. Ed, please join the conversation.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Turner, for a very creative and eloquent presentation. Now, my question has to do with Ellen White also, but hopefully it'll come up in a sort of different perspective. I used to, if I didn't understand something in the Bible, go to Ellen White for, quote, more background information. And in many ways it was helpful, but in many ways I wasn't sure what to do with it. But I believe, for fear of misquoting Ellen White, that she also said that if what I have written and said doesn't line up what is in the Bible, then opposite to what you have said, Dr. Turner, in the conundrum you came up with, if what I have written doesn't line up with the Bible, then ignore what I have written. And of course, many of the things she wrote were other historical things, you know, not referring exactly to the Bible directly. So really the question is, first of all, I like your idea of allowing or encouraging us, maybe that's the right word, to be creative, to throw some imagination and creation into, or adding it to what's in the text, trying to dig up things, you know, like a good novel, for example. You know, a good novel gets you thinking about what's going on in the background or anticipating what might happen and so forth. Yeah. But the problem with Ellen White is that I think with every year or decade of history of new, you know, as we go into the future, her relevance, unless you're a diehard Ellen White fan, I guess, her relevance seems to not be so relevant or so on point, so to speak. And so the question is, can we use your approach or add that to the tools that are available? Can we use, how can we use Ellen White without diminishing this imagination and creative approach that you're presenting?
Okay, well, I think when Ellen White approaches many parts of the biblical text, she is providing an interpretation from a particular perspective, which is really often the great controversy paradigm. So the great controversy paradigm is something which is derived from the apocalyptic books of Daniel and Revelation. And reading biblical passages which are not apocalyptic through the great controversy paradigm, you know, put the great controversy spectacles on, can throw up some interesting points. However, we don't have to say that is the only perspective that we can have on a biblical account. So one of the passages we looked at today, you know, with Elijah on Mount Sinai, for example, I imagine, yes, you can read that from the perspective of the great controversy. But is that the primary perspective that we should be applying, or is it a secondary perspective? You know, Gerald mentioned about the children's story that he told, and I said, well, that's a bit like a midrash, you know, on the story. It is one approach to the story, but it wouldn't be safe to say that's the only approach that we can have. So I think we can have a variety of approaches. One of them, looking at things through the great controversy theological template, I wouldn't say is irrelevant, but it isn't always the most appropriate for what you're reading. So I think we can use our reading competence to say, primarily, how should this, if you're talking about narratives or stories, primarily, how should we read it? What is the text suggesting to us as to how it should be interpreted? And if we understand how a biblical narrative operates through, you know, like I mentioned repetition, you know, that's one of the things. What might we learn from that? I think it's perfectly all right to say something totally other than what Ellen White said, simply because we're asking different questions. But I think we can ask different questions of biblical texts. If we ask different questions, we'll get different answers, and not simply to assume that Ellen White's questions are the only valid questions to ask.
Thank you so much, Ed, for that question. And thanks, Dr. Turner. So, Art, it is now time for you to join the conversation.
Yes, thank you. And as always, Dr. Turner, your presentations are thought-provoking and appreciated by, I think, most of us. I think you just commented that Ellen White shouldn't be used, that, well, are the questions she's asking, do we need to ask those same questions? Apparently we could ask other questions. You're saying that's okay. I would suggest it might be okay to have other answers than her as well. And the question I would, and I don't know how much of a question this is, but Ellen White has been, I suggest, a great benefit to the church, but is also a tremendous detriment to the church as well, because theologians have been allowed to ask the same questions she did, and even to ask other questions, but their answers need to be the same. And other theologians have answered some of the questions differently and have given other answers than hers and have paid for it with their careers. And if Ellen White, and at first, for purposes of this discussion, let me just say that I'll assume, though I don't in my actual life, I'll assume that Ellen White was a prophet. I would wonder what the purpose of the prophet would be. Is it to put a hedge around the people of the church to make sure they don't think anything that's wrong? I suggest that it would be more appropriate and would fit more in the prophetic tradition if she were a gate rather than a hedge. A gate to better thoughts and even thoughts beyond what her thoughts were and that were different than her thoughts. I think sometimes about how, when I read some of the books about the early Adventist church, how poorly I would have fit in there. And I think a lot of you would have as well. Some months ago, I read the biography of J.N. Andrews by Gil Valentine. And he talks about how in 1870, the workers at the Review and Herald publishing house there in Battle Creek had been working so hard that they just, they were worn out. And in April, they decided to give them a rare day off other than Sabbath, because in those days, and certainly the Review and Herald publishing people worked 6 days a week, with Sabbath being their only day off. And so they had a picnic at a local park. And Valentine says it was a rather stiff affair No games or lighthearted banter allowed. It started with a temperance talk in the morning, followed by singing and testimonies in the afternoon, somewhat unlike some of the picnics we go on. And Uriah Smith reported the day a success because there was a, quote, gratifying absence of fun. And then Ellen White also noted approvingly the absence of, quote, joking and jesting. Spare me from such picnics. If you invite me to one of those, I will not go. But my point being rather that I would kind of leave it with the point that she should be treated as a gate rather than a hedge. Your thoughts?
Yes, I think that's an interesting analogy. I think we've done Ellen White a disservice, but we've also done ourselves a disservice by making her something which is not really what I think a New Testament prophet is about. I think we often assume that New Testament prophets are just the same as Old Testament prophets. They're not, but then even the Old Testament prophets weren't giving people the correct interpretation of Moses. They weren't doing that. They were more concerned about things that some people call social justice. I know in some quarters, even mentioning social justice is proof that you're not a prophet, but that's what most of the prophets were concerned with. In other words, not doctrines to believe, but actions to do. And I think we need more grown-up discussions about the benefit of Ellen White and how some uses of her are not to our benefit or to hers. Yeah. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Art, for that question. And yeah, I'll attend the picnic when you plan it, Art. David, you've been pretty active in the chat, so very happy to invite you to unmute and join the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Hello. So yeah, I put the comment in there when you were talking about Midrash, and I remember who it was shared their story about their retelling of a Bible story. I was thinking about fan fiction, there's so many different fandoms, Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings are the big ones, but there are a million little ones. And they have communities around them where people will just write their own stories about the characters. What happens to them? What do they do? What happens after the stories we know? All these sorts of things. And it is a playful thing. And some of it is just they make up whatever they want to make up. But it is also very much tied up with community. These are also communities that are talking deeply about why would this character do this? Is this consistent? Is what they did in the TV show or the book or the movie consistent with who they are, who I think they are? What about the details of this, the details of that? And there's a level of engagement here that is so lacking from the way we engage the Bible. That, we don't really know much about Judas, but he was a bad guy. That's it. That's the end of the story. Or we can learn a lesson from him. Yeah. As opposed to, let's tell stories. Let's talk about these people. Let's dig deeply into what is happening with these stories. So I just want to say thank you, I guess. Throw this out there, but also say thank you for this presentation and talking about the importance of that, of imagination and play and these things when we're engaging story. Because that is how we change. That is how we grow.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I know some of the most inspiring and beneficial sessions I've had with students over the years is when I've taken the time to deal with, how biblical narratives operate, the characteristics and conventions they use, and then just simply to give them a biblical narrative and say, okay, run with it. What do you see? What don't you understand? How do you think? Just creatively work with it, and it's amazing what comes out of it, which is more than just repeating what's in the story. And when people are creative with it, and it's based on a text that people know, it's amazing how inspiring it can be in your life as well. So this sort of freedom to interact, not just with a biblical story, but with each other as we are reacting as well. So, you know, like a Sabbath school discussion where we simply throw in a Bible story and say, what do you see? What do you understand? What do you not understand? What do you find challenging? What do you find helpful? Well, just forces people to react with a biblical text and not read it secondhand through a commentary or through Ellen White or through somebody else. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. As you were speaking, David, I was reminded of the TV series The Chosen, that, you know, helps to fill in some of that backstory that we don't get in the Bible. And of course, you know, there are persons who think, oh, you're taking too much liberties with the text, but I found it beautiful to imagine, you know, as you say, you talk about Judas, to see the whole of what that person could be. As you say, he was one of the 12. You know, what could Jesus have seen in him, even though, you know, we know what happened in the end. So it is beautiful to be able to have that kind of imagination. Lauren, back to you to join the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to, which I always do about this time, is remind people what's happening next week. Next week, Dr. Jim Walters is going to be here from Loma Linda University School of Religion. Retired now, but still very, very active in things going on around Loma Linda. So he's going to be teaching for us. I want to say, I think David's comment on fan fiction is rather brilliant. I've noticed these fan fiction groups, and people will write out whole screenplays. And it has even happened that those who write the scripts for TV programs will draw on these fan fiction stories in order to create a new story for their series. And it's not just Star Wars, David. It's you know, minor things like a TV sitcom or something, and people do fan fiction. And as I was thinking about that, Dr. Turner, it occurred to me that it's not entirely unlike what some of the Midrash writers did. If you really look at it, they told stories about things that happened to Bible characters that kind of became part of Jewish lore, even though they're not in the Bible. There was fan fiction going on at that level. People were writing stories about, and then it went beyond that. The rabbis would begin telling stories. Some years ago, I read the tales of Rabbi Nachman, and even though they weren't about Bible characters, they were based on Bible principles. And so the rabbis began to, in their preaching, they almost a sort of a homiletical thing, that they began creating stories that had to do, that illustrated things that were happening. The story of trying to work out what really happened in Genesis 1, 2 through 3 came up with there being the notion that Adam had a first wife. Remember that one? Lilith, who was his first wife, and somehow she fell, and so God gave her Eve. They made up fan fiction. That's really what was going on, which I find really interesting and really brilliant. And so far from what we're able to do. Most of the discussions that I hear about biblical exegesis go to ridiculous extremes to try to make sure that it actually matches precisely what was in the Bible. Why not go why not go crazy on these stories? Why not tell them in ways that are useful and interesting to people?
Well, one answer to the why not is you can't control it, can you, Lauren?
No, you really can't.
Who knows where it's going to end up? And if you have nailed your name to the mast that you are seeking truth, we all know that truth is, cube-like in shape, nothing but straight lines.
That's right.
Because you need to be able to control it. So I think that, what David said, what you're saying, I think there are all kinds of ways in which we can take our inspiration from what the Bible does. We see how the Bible is actually, in its stories, is creative in its use of language and idiom and metaphor and all these sorts of things. If the Bible did it, then can we do it? And can we do it with the Bible? As long as we recognize what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
We're not doing sober exegesis. It's, midrash or fan fiction, whatever term you want to give it. That would encourage people in their imaginative engagement. And one of the things about that is that can touch our spiritual dimension far better than a rational description of a doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
If you, there's a lot of difference between reading the recipe for an apple pie and eating your mother's apple pie. If you're actually involved in it, far more than just looking at the theory about it. I was going to say something else, and it's gone from me.
Well, while you think of it, let me throw in here a bit of fan fiction. For example, do any of you remember an old movie with John Denver and George Burge called "Oh God"? If you watch it and see what's going on there, it's brilliant, and it is basically doing a bit of theology in a popular form. Oh God was brilliant, and it's not biblical truth, but it was insightful. That sort of thing. Or I don't know if any of you remember Bill Cosby. I know he's been greatly demoted and is rarely mentioned anyway, but he had his conversations with God, where he would play the part of Noah talking to God, or Abraham talking to God, and Abraham saying back, God, you want me to cut off what? And it was brilliant stuff. This is the kind of work that I think some of the rabbis did.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about something several light years distant from where some people are at the moment.
Exactly.
Because in my own experience, I know when I was writing about biblical narratives, which is how they're normally referred to in scholarly literature, that I could not use the word story and I could not use the word narrative or narrator, because if I did, people would think I was saying it was fiction. Now, I did respond to that and say, Ellen White has a book that we publish, the story of redemption. Am I to assume that is a work of fiction? Uncle Arthur's Bible story, my word, that's a dangerous book to have around, because story, So if we're at the point where we're nervous about even using the word story, midrash or fan fiction is going to be a challenge. That doesn't stop us from doing it. That doesn't stop us from doing it, of course.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. That was quite insightful. Ed, inviting you now to join the conversation.
Do I have 30 seconds?
A little bit more than that, but yeah.
Dr. Turner, first thing, I hope you haven't had any concerns from flooding in your part of England.
Well, not in our exact location, but a few miles up the road, people have. Yeah.
Yeah. Terrible time there. We've spent some time looking at these Bible stories in an imaginative way, and then toward the end, the discussion turned toward Ellen White. And throughout the whole thing, I've been having this nagging feeling that the thing that really lies behind the scene that if influences how we view all this is the subject of inspiration. My notion is we need a more realistic narrative about inspiration to the extent that it's humanly possible to do that. The Bible gives so little information about inspiration. It just said it happened. But we don't know what happened. We don't know how it works. We don't know who it works on and who it doesn't. But in 1978, there was this meeting of evangelicals in Chicago, and they, a couple of years later, came out with Chicago's statement on inerrancy. And I've wondered how much that affected Adventism, because the statements in that Chicago document are very blunt about the nature of inspiration as they saw it. And I'm just curious, did that affect us? Do we need a different narrative about inspiration? I know that Alden Thompson put one forward 27 or 8 years ago and got pilloried for it, for his trouble. But I feel like whatever the denomination says officially, people at the congregational level, at the personal level, I feel need a good, cogent narrative that's realistic about inspiration and how that might affect how we see both the Bible and Ellen White. Any thoughts about that?
Yes, well, I mean, you raise an important point. I think what every, if you're thinking of doctrines of the church, I think what every doctrine, if it's claiming to be based on the Bible, how should it be formulated? How do you go about doing it? Then it should be done inductively. In other words, rather than making the assumption the Bible is the word of God, and then you come with a kind of an idea of what you mean by the word of God, and you bring that to the Bible. When you read the text of the Bible, what can you deduce from that that would inform how you view the inspiration? For example, in the past within the church, back in the 19th century, there was a bit of a hoo-ha over those who believed that there were degrees of inspiration. And it was decided, well, you can't talk about degrees of inspiration. You know, it's either inspired or it isn't. Now, I'm not making a case for this one way or the other, but is it possible for us after this time to go back to the text and inductively, decide when you read it, what do you read and what does that tell you about it, how it came into existence or what kind of authority it has? Especially when some parts of the Bible might seem to say this and another part might seem to say the other. In other words, is the Bible designed to give a unitary picture, Or is it designed to say, sometimes it's like this, but sometimes it's like that? And perhaps both of those views, if they are included within Scripture, maybe we don't have to have one view on something. We might have two views on something or more. That's possible. One of the things he talked about, the inerrancy statement, the Chicago statement. Something which has intrigued me is that we often discuss the mechanics of inspiration and revelation. And so we usually say, we don't believe in verbal dictation of the Bible. We believe more in thought inspiration, which means presumably that there is something of God in this, but also it's conveyed through a human channel. So we want to make sure, we don't believe in verbal inspiration. We believe in plenary inspiration is usually the term that we use. But when it comes to a particular passage, could you demonstrate to me what difference it makes? So what difference does it make to an evangelical subscribing to the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, or to an Adventist, when they come to any particular passage? What difference does it make to how you interpret it? And I'm not aware that it does. On how you view it, the Bible came about, the mode of inspiration, I don't think makes any difference to how people read the text. So why discuss the mode of inspiration? I think that's a bit of a red herring, which I think means all the more we need to consider what you've just spoken about. What do we mean by inspiration? How does it operate? What do we think? And what exactly is the Bible? I know we've got statements on it, but let's not be satisfied with what we've done in the past. Let's move on, have something more mature, and the result of a few more decades of theological reflection. It should be better this time around than it was last time.
All right, thanks, Dr. Turner, for that. Okay, Doug or Teresa, we just have a couple of minutes, so you have the final question. Okay, Doug, go ahead.
That was that was an excellent presentation, and your remarks fit so well with what I was thinking, especially after the brief discussion about fan fiction. It made me think of the statement attributed to Peter that how then ought we to live, or whatever similar translation of those words, because that seemed like to me the bottom line, especially of the Old Testament prophets, who presumably had the right doctrines. The Jews all had the right doctrines. They were going to church on the right day, and they were presumably believing all the right doctrines of Judaism. But it clearly wasn't connecting when I read some of those Old Testament prophets who were reaming them out, to use a common term, about how they were acting with respect to their fellow Israelites and to those who were not. And that seems to be the salient point that I draw from this is I don't see in the synoptics very often that Jesus said, here's what you need to believe. Here's the doctrine you need to adopt. But he simply said, follow me, which is sort of what would I call it? A living narrative where we're walking out what it is that Jesus was wanting to convey to his followers, literally followers, not believers, but followers. And so those were just thoughts that came to mind that seemed to incorporate the living characteristic of what it is to listen to your presentation and try to make that application in my life and as I read the narratives of Scripture. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Doug. I think just to respond briefly to what you said, that when we read a story in the Bible, and say in the Gospels, when we read a story in the Gospels, do we see ourselves in that story as followers of Jesus? And if we do, then we are now part of that story. We are now part of that story. And how is that story going to end? Well, I might have something to say about that if I am now part of that story and I'm now living and, as it were, walking down the road with Jesus and the disciples. That's a simple way of describing it, but I think there's truth in what you say about the scriptures, the biblical stories being invitations to participate, not simply to listen and cogitate.